He didn't just betray his wife. He made sure she had a front row seat to watch it happen. At 8:15 on a cold morning inside JFK Airport, Margaret Whitmore stopped near the first-class boarding line. There he was. Her husband, Charles Bennett, standing tall in his tailored navy suit, one hand pressed gently against the lower back of Vanessa Cole. Not a co-worker. Not a client. The woman everyone had been whispering about. Margaret's fingers tightened around her boarding pass. New York to Dallas. Business conference. Same flight, same destination. But Charles did not step away. He did not look ashamed. Instead, he glanced at Margaret, then leaned closer to Vanessa, speaking just loud enough for his wife to hear. First-class boards first. Vanessa smiled like she had already won. A few passengers turned their heads. One man lowered his newspaper. The air around Margaret seemed to disappear. For 22 years she had stood beside Charles through debt pressure, late nights, and public smiles that hid private wounds. She had protected his name when no one else would, and now he was placing another woman in her seat. Right in front of everyone. Charles tilted his chin. Some trips aren't meant for you anymore. Margaret did not cry. She did not scream. She simply looked at the ticket in her hand, then at the woman on his arm. And in that quiet second something inside her changed. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and made one call that would turn his perfect morning into the beginning of his collapse. The phone rang only twice before a calm male voice answered. Whitmore Trust Office. This is Harold. Margaret stood near the wide airport window watching the gray morning light slide across the runway. Her husband was still behind her. Charles Bennett. The man who had just humiliated her in front of strangers. The man who thought her silence meant weakness. Margaret lowered her voice. Harold, I need you to review the executive travel package for Bennett Meridian Group. Immediately. There was a brief pause on the line. All of it, Mrs. Whitmore. All of it, she said. Flights. VIP lounge access, chauffeured cars, hotel reservations, and the private jet on standby. Behind her, Charles let out a short laugh. Vanessa Cole tilted her head, amused. Oh, Margaret, Vanessa said softly. Now you're going to pretend you still have power. Margaret slowly turned. For the first time that morning she looked directly at Vanessa. Her eyes were dry. Her face was calm. No, Vanessa, she said. I'm done pretending I don't. The smile disappeared from Vanessa's lips. Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice like a warning. Margaret, don't embarrass yourself. But Margaret had already turned away. She listened as Harold's fingers moved quickly over a keyboard on the other end of the call. In the first-class line, passengers pretended not to notice. But they noticed. A woman in a beige coat paused with her coffee halfway to her mouth. A businessman stopped scrolling on his phone. Even the gate agent glanced up. Then Harold spoke again. Mrs. Whitmore, the full executive mobility package is tied to your personal guarantee through the Whitmore Trust. Margaret closed her eyes for 1 second. She had known. But hearing it confirmed made the betrayal colder. How much, she asked. $22 million. The number hung in the air. Charles's expression changed. Just slightly. Not enough for strangers to see. But Margaret saw it. She had been married to him for more than 2 decades. She knew every muscle in his face, every fake smile, every little twitch of panic he tried to hide. Harold continued. There was also an added authorization last night. It was attached to today's Dallas trip and marked as strategic communications. Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. I did not approve that. No, ma'am. It appears to have been entered through a temporary executive communications credential. Margaret looked past Charles. Vanessa was holding a blue folder against her chest. Too tightly. A folder with the company's internal seal printed on the corner. And suddenly the scene became clear. This was not just a husband flaunting another woman. This was not just cruelty dressed in first-class tickets. Something had been prepared. Something meant to happen in Dallas. Something Margaret was never supposed to see until it was too late. She took a slow breath. Harold, she said, freeze all personal executive privileges linked to Charles Bennett and Vanessa Cole. Keep every operational booking active. No employees are to be affected. No business teams lose transportation, lodging, or support. Charles's face darkened. Margaret. She raised one hand without looking at him. Harold answered carefully. Understood. Personal privileges only. Company operations remain protected. Put it in writing, Margaret said. This is not retaliation. This is prevention of improper use. At that moment the gate agent's tablet chimed. The young woman behind the counter looked down. Her practiced smile slipped for half a second. Margaret saw it. So did Vanessa. Mr. Bennett, the agent said. Stepping forward, Miss Cole, we need to review your access before boarding. Charles blinked. My authorization has been approved for years. The agent kept her voice polite. There has been an update to the executive package. The first-class line went quiet. Charles looked at Margaret as if he were seeing her for the first time in years. Not as the quiet wife. Not as the woman he could shame and leave standing at the gate. But as the signature behind the luxury. The name behind the safety net. The power he had mistaken for obedience. Vanessa hugged the blue folder closer. Her confidence was gone now. Margaret ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. No tears. No shouting. Just a woman standing perfectly still while a man's carefully polished world began to crack in public. And for the first time that morning Charles Bennett had nothing clever to say. The gate agent's words hung over the first-class line like smoke. There has been an update to the executive package. Charles Bennett stared at her. Then at Margaret. Then back at the tablet in the agent's hand as if the screen had personally betrayed him. This is a mistake, he said. His voice was lower now. Not proud. Not cruel. Careful. Vanessa Cole shifted beside him, the blue folder pressed so tightly against her ribs that the edge bent under her fingers. Margaret noticed. She noticed everything now. For years she had trained herself to ignore the small details. The late calls. The locked phone. The sudden perfume on Charles's shirts. The way Vanessa always stood half a step too close during company events. But not today. Today every detail had teeth. A supervisor approached from the premium counter. Gray suit. Polished shoes. A face built for difficult conversations. "Mr. Bennett," he said with a calm that made the moment even worse, "Miss Cole, please come with me. We need to review your access to the lounge ground transfer hotel suite and backup aircraft." Backup aircraft. The words landed hard. A man standing nearby slowly lowered his phone. A woman in pearls turned just enough to watch without seeming to watch. Charles's jaw tightened. "Margaret," he said, barely moving his lips. "This affects the company." Margaret looked at him. For once there was no anger in her face. Only clarity. "No," she said. "What affects the company is you confusing company resources with your private life." Charles flinched. Just a little. But enough. Because the truth had hit him in front of witnesses. The private jet. The VIP lounge. The first-class seats. The black cars waiting in Dallas. The executive hotel suite. None of it belonged to him the way he had pretended it did. All of it rested on a foundation Margaret had quietly built years ago. A foundation he had mocked. A foundation he now needed. The supervisor gestured toward the counter. "Sir, this way." For a moment, Charles did not move. He looked like a man refusing to accept that the floor beneath him had disappeared. Then the gate agent's tablet chimed again. The sound was small. Almost gentle. But it cut through him. Charles turned and walked toward the premium counter. Vanessa followed. Her heels clicked against the polished airport floor, but the rhythm was uneven now. Fast, nervous. Margaret stayed where she was. She could still hear Harold's voice from the call. $22 million. Her personal guarantee. Signed 4 years ago. She remembered that night like a scar. Not a ballroom. Not a press conference. Not a smiling photo in a business magazine. A small conference room with tired coffee legal papers stacked in front of her and Charles sitting in the next room because he could not bear to watch his wife save him. Back then Bennett Meridian Group had been close to breaking. Contracts at risk. Credit lines frozen. Employees afraid their paychecks would stop. Charles had called it a rough season. Margaret had known it was a cliff. So she signed. Not for applause. Not for control. For the people whose names Charles, and somehow over time he had turned her sacrifice into something he resented. The more he depended on her, the more he tried to make her feel small. Now he stood at the counter, arguing softly with a supervisor who no longer treated him like royalty. Vanessa opened the blue folder. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Inside were printed documents. Company letterhead, highlighted sections. A tab marked Dallas Executive Communications. Then, Vanessa turned slightly, unlocking her phone with a shaking thumb. Margaret caught only a glimpse. A message thread. A short line on the screen. "If she blocks the trust, use the memo." Vanessa snapped the phone dark. Too late. Margaret had seen it. Her breath stopped for half a second. So this morning had not been reckless. It had been planned. The public humiliation. The first-class line. The Dallas trip. The secret authorization. And now a memo waiting as a weapon. Margaret picked up her purse. She did not walk toward Charles. She did not confront Vanessa. Not yet. She turned away from the boarding gate and moved toward a quiet corner near the airport cafe. Behind her, Charles's voice rose for the first time. "Margaret." She kept walking. No one stopped her. Because the woman he had tried to discard was no longer standing in the place he left her. She was already 3 steps ahead. At the far end of the airport cafe, Margaret Whitmore sat alone. Not because she was weak. Because she needed silence. Around her travelers dragged carry-ons over tile. Espresso machines hissed. Boarding announcements echoed through the terminal like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Her marriage had cracked open in public. And beneath the affair, Margaret could now see something darker moving underneath. She placed her purse on the chair beside her and opened the private Whitmore Trust portal on her phone. Her thumb moved with perfect control, but her chest felt tight. Charles Bennett had not simply brought Vanessa Cole on a business trip. He had brought her into the machinery of the company. Into authorizations. Into communications. Into money. Into power. Margaret stared at the screen while Harold's secure message arrived. Authorization added 10:47 p.m. last night. Temporary executive communications credential, linked to Dallas strategy meeting, approved under Charles Bennett. Margaret read it once. Then again. The words blurred for a moment, not from tears but from fury so cold it almost felt calm. A temporary credential. A secret communication approval. A blue folder. And Vanessa's message. If she blocks the trust, use the memo. Margaret set the phone on the table. For 22 years, she had understood betrayal in the ordinary ways. A missed anniversary. A closed door. A lie that arrived dressed as business. But this was different. This was organized. Prepared. Timed. Charles had planned to parade Vanessa through first class, make Margaret feel small, then arrive in Dallas with a document already waiting. A memo. A weapon. Maybe meant to pressure the board. Maybe meant to question Margaret's judgment. Maybe meant to make her look emotional, unstable, vindictive. The thoughts settled in her stomach like ice. They were not just replacing her in his arms. They were trying to replace her in the company. Her phone rang. Harold. Margaret answered before the second ring. I saw the authorization, she said. I know, Harold replied. His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge beneath it. And there is more. Margaret looked toward the gate. Through the glass partition she could see Charles at the premium counter, one hand on his hip trying to appear in control. Vanessa stood beside him, whispering fast. What else? Margaret asked. The Dallas meeting agenda was changed late last night. The original agenda was operational review. Fleet costs. Regional expansion. Vendor contracts. And now? A pause. Now it includes a preliminary executive statement. Margaret's eyes narrowed. What kind of statement? It appears to question the Whitmore Trust's influence over Bennett Meridian Group. For the first time that morning, Margaret's hand went still. The coffee in front of her had gone untouched. Cold already. Just like the woman she had been forced to become. Harold continued carefully. The wording suggests the company may need to distance itself from personal financial interference. Margaret gave a quiet laugh. Not amused? Wounded. They were going to call my protection interference. Yes, ma'am. The guarantee that kept their doors open. Yes. The money that kept their employees paid. Yes. Margaret looked down at her wedding ring. For years that ring had felt like a promise. Now it looked like evidence. She turned it slowly on her finger. Charles had not only forgotten what she had done for him, he had rewritten it. In his version, she was not the woman who saved the company. She was the obstacle. The controlling wife. The problem to be removed. The humiliation at the gate had been bait. If she exploded, they would use the memo. If she cried, they would use the memo. If she blocked the trust, they would use the memo. Margaret leaned back in her chair. And suddenly, everything became simple. Harold, she said. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Secure every document connected to last night's authorization. Preserve the access logs. Save all edits to the Dallas agenda. No deletions. No quiet corrections. Already underway. And notify legal compliance. Another pause. This one shorter. Internal or external counsel. Margaret looked again toward Charles. He was smiling now. A fake smile. The one he used when he believed he could still talk his way out of consequences. Margaret picked up her coffee at last. But she did not drink it. Both, she said. Across the terminal, Vanessa turned her head. Their eyes met. For 1 second the younger woman's face changed. The confidence vanished. Because she finally understood. Margaret was not reacting to the affair anymore. She was following the trail. And that trail led straight to the heart of the company. Margaret ended the call and stood. No rush. No drama. No trembling. Just a woman rising from a cafe table while an entire empire began to realize she had been the quiet pillar holding it up. And now that pillar was moving. Vanessa Cole's blue folder never left her hands. Not when the supervisor asked for her ID. Not when Charles Bennett leaned over the premium counter trying to smile his way past a frozen access code. Not when the gate agent politely told them their private transfer in Dallas was under review. She held that folder, like it was the last locked door between her and disaster. Margaret Whitmore saw it from across the terminal. And now she knew. That folder was not just paperwork. It was a weapon. She moved through the airport with steady steps, her heels tapping against the polished floor. No rushing. No scene. Every movement controlled. Charles saw her coming and straightened, slipping back into the version of himself he used in boardrooms. "Margaret," he said softer now. "This has gone far enough." Vanessa stood beside him, lips pressed tight, the folder hugged against her cream-colored coat. Margaret stopped a few feet away. "No," she said. "It hasn't gone far enough." The supervisor glanced between them, uncomfortable. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're still reviewing the authorization." Margaret gave him a polite nod. "Thank you. Please continue." Then she looked at Vanessa. "Open the folder." Vanessa blinked. "I'm sorry. You heard me." Charles stepped in quickly. "That folder contains company material. You don't get to demand?" Margaret turned her eyes to him. "One look?" That was all it took. His words died in his throat. For 22 years Charles had mistaken her restraint for permission. He had thought silence meant surrender. He had forgotten the woman who sat across from lenders when he could not. The woman who signed guarantees when his empire was shaking. The woman whose name still held the doors open. Vanessa shifted her weight. "This is for the Dallas communications meeting," she said. "It has nothing to do with you." Margaret's face did not move. "Everything tied to the Whitmore Trust has something to do with me." A boarding announcement crackled overhead. Passengers moved around them slowly, pretending not to listen. But everyone listened. Vanessa's fingers slid over the folder's edge. A small movement. Protective. Guilty. Margaret noticed the company seal stamped in dark blue. Bennett Meridian Group. Internal Communications. The tab at the top read Dallas Statement Preliminary. There it was. The memo. The second plan. The thing Vanessa's phone had warned about. If she blocks the trust, use the memo. Margaret felt a pulse of pain behind her ribs. Not because she was surprised anymore. Because the cruelty had become so organized. Charles had not simply betrayed her. He had prepared to make her look like the danger. A wife acting emotionally. A fund interfering personally. A woman too hurt to be trusted with power. And Vanessa had carried the script in her hands. Margaret reached into her purse and took out her phone again. "Harold," she said when the call connected, "I'm standing in front of the blue folder." Vanessa's eyes widened. Charles leaned closer. "Don't do this here." Margaret ignored him. "It is marked Dallas Statement Preliminary. Internal Communications Seal." Vanessa Cole is holding it. Harold's voice was low and immediate. "Document the chain of possession." Margaret raised her phone and took a photo. One sharp camera click. That tiny sound hit harder than a shout. Vanessa jerked backward. "You can't photograph confidential materials." Margaret lowered the phone. "I just photographed a company document tied to an authorization I never approved, funded through a guarantee in my name." The supervisor's expression changed. Now he was listening differently. Charles looked from Margaret to the supervisor, then to the folder. For the first time he looked afraid of paper. Margaret stepped closer to Vanessa. "Did you write it?" Vanessa swallowed. No answer. "Did Charles approve it?" Still nothing. Margaret nodded slowly. That silence was enough. Behind them the first-class boarding line had started moving. People were stepping onto the jet bridge, leaving for Dallas with coffee cups, briefcases, and lives that had not just exploded. Charles and Vanessa remained behind, grounded. Exposed? Margaret looked at the blue folder one last time. It had been meant to erase her. To turn her sacrifice into suspicion, to dress betrayal in corporate language. But now it had done the opposite. It had shown her exactly where to look. She turned to the supervisor. "Please make sure neither of them boards using privileges connected to the executive package until legal review is complete." Then she looked at Charles. Not as a wife begging for answers. As the woman whose signature still held the walls around him. "You wanted a trip without me," she said. Her voice stayed quiet. "Now you have one without my protection." And in the bright airport terminal, surrounded by strangers and silence, Vanessa Cole finally lowered the blue folder from her chest. Like even she knew it could no longer save them. Charles Bennett turned sharply toward Margaret. "You are making a mistake," he said. His voice was low now. Not because he was calm. Because too many people were listening. Margaret stood near the premium counter, phone in hand, while Vanessa Cole held the blue folder like it had suddenly grown heavy. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, just to confirm, the review applies only to personal executive privileges." Margaret nodded. "Yes." She looked directly at Charles. "The employees still fly, the operations team still boards, the drivers still meet them in Dallas. The hotel rooms for authorized staff remain active." Charles blinked. That was not what he expected. He had wanted rage. He had wanted her to overreach. He had wanted witnesses. A wounded wife making a mess in an airport. But Margaret had given him something far more dangerous. Precision. The supervisor checked his tablet again. So the company's business schedule remains unaffected. Correct, Margaret said. This is not a shutdown. This is not revenge. This is a stop on personal misuse. Vanessa's mouth tightened. Charles tried to laugh, but the sound came out dry. Personal misuse. Margaret, listen to yourself. You are blocking the president of the company from attending a major meeting. No, Margaret said. I am blocking the president of the company from using a trust-backed luxury package to travel with an unauthorized companion, carrying documents tied to an authorization I never approved. The words landed clean. A man in line stopped pretending to look at his watch. The gate agent lowered her eyes to the tablet, but even she froze for half a second. Charles's face flushed. You don't understand what is at stake. Margaret took one step closer. I understand exactly what is at stake. Her voice did not rise. That made it worse. 400 employees. Active contracts. Vendor payments. Regional service commitments. Payroll. Families who depend on checks arriving on time. Charles opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because for years he had spoken about the company like it was his kingdom. Margaret spoke about it like it was people. She turned back to the supervisor. Please make a written note that operational staff must not be delayed. Anyone listed under technical logistics, finance, or legal travel approval remains cleared. Only discretionary executive benefits connected to Charles Bennett and Vanessa Cole are suspended pending review. The supervisor nodded quickly. I'll document that now. Harold's voice came through Margaret's phone, still connected on speaker at a low volume. I have already sent the written confirmation to Compliance, Legal and Travel Administration. Margaret answered without looking away from Charles. Good. Charles heard it. So did Vanessa. There would be a record. No emotional confusion. No way to twist it later. No way to claim Margaret had damaged the company out of jealousy. Vanessa stepped forward, forcing a polished smile. Mrs. Whitmore, I think everyone is getting carried away. This folder is for messaging, nothing more. We have a responsibility to protect the company's image. Margaret turned slowly. Whose image? Vanessa went silent. Margaret let the question sit there. Then she looked at the folder. You were prepared to protect Charles's image. Not the company. For the first time, Vanessa looked truly cornered. Behind them, another boarding announcement echoed across the terminal. The Dallas flight was entering final call for first class. A gate agent approached the supervisor and whispered something. He nodded, then faced Charles with professional regret. Mr. Bennett, your personal first-class boarding access is currently suspended. We can rebook you under a standard commercial fare if approved by the corporate travel desk, but the VIP lounge, private transfer, executive hotel suite and standby aircraft are not available at this time. Charles stared at him. The words were polite. But the meaning was brutal. The king had been removed from his throne, not by a scandal, not by shouting, by authorization rules, by paper trails, by the wife he had treated like furniture. Vanessa looked toward the jet bridge where the authorized operations staff were still boarding. 2 company employees passed by with laptop bags, confused but unharmed. Margaret watched them go. That mattered. They were not collateral damage. They were the reason she had stayed calm. Charles leaned toward her, his voice suddenly softer. Margaret, please. We can talk about this. She looked at him. 22 years of marriage sat between them. Every dinner alone. Every excuse. Every time she had swallowed pain to keep the walls from cracking. Then she said, You had years to talk. Charles's eyes flickered. Margaret slipped her phone into her purse. The company goes on, she said. Your privileges do not. The supervisor stepped aside, already typing the final note into the system. Vanessa lowered her gaze. Charles stood frozen under the bright airport lights. And all around them the business world kept moving. Flights departed. Employees boarded. Engines roared outside the glass. But Charles Bennett stayed behind. For the first time in years, the company survived without protecting his pride. Charles Bennett found his voice again when the supervisor stepped away. It came back sharp. Desperate. Dressed up as concern. You realize what you're doing, don't you? He said, turning so the nearby passengers could hear just enough. You're putting the whole company at risk because you're angry. Margaret Whitmore looked at him for a long second. There it was. The trap. The exact picture he wanted to paint. A jealous wife. A public scene. A woman too emotional to understand business. Vanessa Cole stood beside him, still holding the blue folder, but now her eyes were fixed on Margaret's face, waiting for one crack. One tear. One raised voice. One word they could use later. Margaret gave them none. The airport moved around them in bright, indifferent motion. Wheels rolled over tile. A child cried near the snack shop. Outside the glass, a jet began to taxi toward the runway. Margaret stood still. Calm. Clear. Charles, she said, do not confuse embarrassment with damage. His jaw tightened. You froze my access. I froze personal privileges. You blocked my travel. I protected company resources. You're doing this because of Vanessa. Margaret's eyes moved to the woman beside him. Vanessa lifted her chin, trying to look innocent. Margaret turned back to Charles. I'm doing this because last night someone used a temporary executive communications credential to create an authorization tied to a trip funded by my guarantee. Charles's face hardened. That's internal strategy. No, Margaret said. That is unauthorized access. A few people near the gate stopped pretending. They were listening openly now. Charles lowered his voice, but the anger pushed through. You always do this. You make everything about control. Margaret almost smiled. Not from joy. From recognition. She had heard that word so many times. Control. That was what he called responsibility when it came from her. That was what he called caution when it stopped him from making reckless decisions. That was what he called protection when he no longer wanted to admit he needed it. She stepped closer. 4 years ago, when the banks closed your credit line, was that control? Charles looked away. When vendor payments were overdue and your employees were afraid they wouldn't be paid, was that control? He said nothing. When I signed a $22 million guarantee so Bennett Meridian Group could survive, was that control? The silence became heavy. Vanessa's grip tightened on the blue folder again. Margaret's voice stayed low, but every word carried. You were happy to use my signature when it saved you. Now that I'm stopping you from abusing it, suddenly I'm unstable. Charles glanced toward the gate agent, then toward the passengers. He could feel the story slipping away from him. So he reached for the one weapon he had left. Margaret, he said softer now, wounded on purpose after everything we've built together, you're really going to humiliate me in an airport? For a second the sentence hit the old place in her heart. The place that had forgiven too much. The place that had stayed quiet at dinners, smiled at galas, and carried his failures like they were her duty. Then she saw Vanessa's hand on the folder. She saw the memo. She saw the plan. And the old place in her heart closed. You humiliated yourself, Margaret said. You brought your mistress into a first-class line, attached her to company privileges, and let her carry documents designed to weaken the trust that saved your business. Charles flinched. That word hit him hardest. Mistress. Not partner. Not colleague. Mistress. Plain. Undeniable. Vanessa's face went pale. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quickly, this is inappropriate. Margaret turned to her. No, Vanessa. What's inappropriate is hiding behind corporate language while helping a married executive turn company funds into a private reward. Vanessa opened her mouth. No words came. The supervisor returned, tablet in hand. Mrs. Whitmore, the note has been added. All authorized operational personnel remain cleared. Personal executive services for Mr. Bennett and Miss Cole remain suspended pending review. Margaret nodded. Thank you. Charles stared at her like he was waiting for the woman he knew to come back. The quiet one. The patient one. The wife who swallowed betrayal to keep peace. But she was gone. Margaret picked up her carry-on handle and looked toward the gate where the last authorized employees were disappearing down the jet bridge. The company will make it to Dallas, she said. Then she looked back at Charles. You just won't use it as cover anymore. Outside, the airplane engines rose into a low, powerful roar. Inside, Charles stood under the terminal lights with nothing but his suit, his pride, and the woman who had helped him lose both. Margaret walked away. No shouting. No shaking. No apology. And for the first time all morning, every eye in that terminal understood the truth. She was not destroying his company. She was saving it from him. Margaret Whitmore did not leave the airport. Not yet. She walked past the boarding gate, past the luxury shops, past the glowing departure screens, and stopped at a quiet cafe tucked near the end of the terminal. There she sat at a small round table with an untouched black coffee in front of her. Her phone rested beside it. The screen lit up again. Harold. Margaret answered. Tell me. His voice came through low and precise. I found the authorization. Margaret looked toward the glass wall. Outside, planes rolled slowly across the runway, massive and calm, as if the world had not just shifted beneath her feet. When was it created? She asked. Last night. 10:47 p.m. Her eyes closed for one brief second. Last night. While she had been upstairs in their home, reading alone in the bedroom. While Charles had claimed he needed to review numbers for Dallas. While Vanessa had probably been waiting somewhere with that blue folder already prepared. Margaret opened her eyes. Where did it come from? A temporary executive communications credential. The words landed cold. Temporary. Not standard. Not routine. Someone had created a door that should not have existed. Margaret's fingers wrapped around the coffee cup, but she still did not drink. Who approved it? Harold paused. That silence told her enough. Say it. The system lists approval from Charles Bennett. The cafe noise seemed to fade. A spoon clinked against a mug nearby. A woman laughed softly at another table. A boarding call echoed somewhere far away. But Margaret heard only one thing. Charles had approved it. Not by accident. Not through carelessness. By choice. Harold continued. The authorization is tied directly to the Dallas meeting and marked under Strategic Communications. Margaret's gaze sharpened. Strategic Communications, she repeated. That was Vanessa's department. The department that polished disasters until they sounded like leadership. The department that turned betrayal into messaging. The department that knew how to make a victim look unreasonable if the press release was clean enough. Margaret thought of the blue folder. The internal seal. The tab marked Dallas statement. And the phone message she had seen. If she blocks the trust, use the memo. Now the pieces locked together. Charles flaunting Vanessa was only the visible wound. The real knife had been hidden in paperwork. A secret authorization. A prepared statement. A Dallas meeting. A plan to distance Bennett Meridian Group from the Whitmore Trust by making Margaret look like a threat. She leaned back slowly. For 22 years she had treated silence like dignity. She had believed that not reacting made her strong. But men like Charles used silence like empty space. They filled it with their own version of the story. Harold's voice softened. Mrs. Whitmore, do you want me to cancel the authorization completely? Margaret looked down at her wedding ring. The diamond caught the airport light. Cold. Bright. Useless. No, she said. Harold went quiet. No. Preserve it first. Every timestamp. Every login. Every edit. Every name attached to it. I understand. And copy legal compliance. Already prepared. Not just internal, Margaret said. She looked across the terminal. Charles and Vanessa were still near the premium counter. Charles spoke into his phone, now pacing like a man trying to keep a storm inside a paper bag. Vanessa stood close, whispering fast, the blue folder against her chest again. Margaret watched them carefully. External counsel, too. Harold's answer came immediately. Yes, ma'am. Margaret's voice lowered. And Harold? Yes? Check whether that temporary credential has been used before. There was another pause. This time it was not hesitation. It was realization. I'll run the full history. Margaret ended the call. For a moment, she sat completely still. Then her phone buzzed with a new message from Harold. A document preview. One line highlighted. Preliminary statement: Bennett Meridian Group must protect itself from personal financial influence that could destabilize future operations. Margaret stared at the words. Personal financial influence. That was what they called the guarantee that saved them. Destabilizing. That was what they called the woman who kept their employees paid. Her pain became something quieter than anger. Something stronger. Across the terminal, Charles looked up and caught her eyes. He tried to hold her stare. He failed. Margaret picked up her phone, stood and walked back toward him. Not as a betrayed wife. Not as a humiliated woman. As the one person who had finally found the hidden door. And now she had the key. Margaret Whitmore stopped halfway back to the premium counter. A memory hit her so hard she nearly forgot where she was. 4 years earlier. A small conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown office tower. Rain sliding down the windows. Cold coffee in paper cups. A stack of documents sitting in front of her like a sentence. Back then, Bennett Meridian Group was not an empire. It was a building on fire. Vendors were calling after midnight. Banks had frozen the credit line. 5 major contracts were hanging by threads. Payroll was due in 6 days and more than 400 employees had no idea how close they were to losing everything. Charles had called it temporary pressure. Margaret had known better. She remembered Harold sitting beside her, quiet and serious, his glasses low on his nose as he turned the pages. Mrs. Whitmore, he had said carefully, once you sign, the trust is exposed. Margaret had looked through the glass wall into the next room. Charles stood there alone, facing the window, one hand in his pocket, the other gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He could not sit beside her. He could not watch her save him. Pride would not let him. So Margaret picked up the pen. Not because Charles deserved it. Because the company's workers did. The warehouse manager with 3 children. The dispatcher who had cared for her sick husband. The drivers who left before sunrise. The young accountants who still believed loyalty meant something. Margaret signed her name. $22 million in guarantees. Her family trust. Her responsibility. Her risk. The pen scratched across the final page and Harold quietly exhaled. That will keep the company alive, he said. Margaret remembered thinking Charles would understand someday. That he would come into the room, take her hand and say the words he had avoided for years. Thank you. He never did. Instead, he walked in 10 minutes later, adjusted his cufflinks and said, "We should keep this quiet. No need to make it look like I needed rescuing." That was the first crack. Not the affair. Not Vanessa. That. The moment Margaret realized a man could accept salvation and still hate the person who gave it. Now standing in the bright airport terminal, the memory burned behind her eyes. Charles had not just forgotten what she had done. He had buried it. Then he had built a new story on top of it, one where he was the genius, the founder, the visionary, and Margaret was just the cautious wife standing too close to his spotlight. She looked ahead. Charles was still near the counter, phone pressed to his ear, pacing in short, angry lines. Vanessa watched him like she was trying to measure how much power he had left. Not much. Margaret walked forward. Charles ended his call the moment he saw her. "Margaret," he said, forcing his voice into something softer. "This is bigger than us?" She nodded once. "Yes. It always was." He looked relieved for half a second, mistaking her calm for surrender. Then, she continued. "That is why I signed when the company was 6 days from missing payroll." His face froze. Vanessa's eyes flicked to him. Margaret took another step. "That is why I put the Whitmore Trust behind your loans when the bank stopped trusting you." "Margaret," Charles warned. "No," she said. "You don't get to erase that anymore." The supervisor looked down at his tablet, pretending to work. But he heard every word. So did the gate agent. So did Vanessa. Margaret's voice stayed steady. "I did not sign for first-class seats. I did not sign for private cars. I did not sign so you could hand my protection to another woman and call my sacrifice interference." Charles swallowed. For once he looked smaller than his suit. Margaret looked past him at the jet bridge where the company's authorized staff had already boarded. "They are the reason I signed," she said. "Not you." The words struck harder than shouting ever could. Charles's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Because deep down he remembered that room. The rain. The papers. The wife who saved him while he stood outside pretending not to need saving. Margaret turned slightly toward Vanessa. "And that is why the blue folder matters. Because it was never just about a trip. It was about rewriting who held this company together." Vanessa lowered her eyes. For the first time she looked less like a rival and more like someone who had joined a war without understanding the battlefield. Margaret faced Charles again. "The company survived because I protected it once," she said. "And today I'm protecting it again." Outside, an aircraft lifted into the cloudy morning sky. Inside, Charles Bennett stood grounded. Not by security. Not by bad luck. By the truth he had spent 4 years trying to hide. Charles Bennett's silence did not last. It never did. Men like Charles could stand in failure for only a few seconds before turning it into someone else's fault. He looked at Margaret Whitmore with a tight smile, the kind he used in boardrooms when a deal was falling apart. "You always wanted this," he said. Margaret stood still. "What?" "To stand over me. To remind everyone I needed you." Vanessa Cole lifted her eyes from the blue folder. Even she seemed unsure where Charles was going. But Charles kept going. Because pride once wounded does not limp away quietly. It swings. "You signed the guarantee," "Yes," he said. "You helped the company. But after that you never let me forget it." Margaret stared at him. For a moment the airport disappeared. She was back in their home. At long dinner tables where Charles barely looked up from his phone. In charity galas where he smiled for cameras and let go of her hand the second the flash ended. In company receptions where he introduced Vanessa with warmth, then introduced Margaret like an obligation. "My wife, Margaret." That was all. Never the woman who saved the company. Never the woman whose trust carried his empire through the storm. Just the wife. Quiet. Useful. Expected to stand nearby. She remembered the little punishments. The comments made with a smile. "You're too cautious. You don't understand growth. You think like a banker, not a builder." Then worse. "You wouldn't know pressure like this." But she did know pressure. She knew the pressure of signing away safety so hundreds of families could sleep at night. She knew the pressure of protecting a man who resented being protected. She knew the pressure of loving someone who treated gratitude like humiliation. Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You made me look weak." Margaret's face softened. Not with pity. With understanding? There it was. The truth beneath the affair. Beneath Vanessa. Beneath the blue folder. Beneath the public cruelty in the first-class line. Charles had not betrayed her because she failed him. He betrayed her because she had saved him. And he could never forgive her for it. Margaret looked at him carefully. "No," she said. "You felt weak because you needed help." His eyes flashed. "That is not the same thing." For the first time his polished mask slipped completely. The anger under it was old. Older than Vanessa. Older than the Dallas meeting. Older than the airport. You think I don't know what people whispered, Charles said. That Bennett Meridian survived because of Whitmore money. That your family trust carried us. That I was the man whose wife had to rescue him. Margaret's voice stayed quiet. People whispered because it was true. The words struck him like a slap. Vanessa looked away. Charles laughed once, bitter and hollow. And you enjoyed it? Margaret shook her head. No, Charles. I waited for you to come home and thank me. That stopped him. For one small second the anger drained from his face. A memory passed between them. The rain-soaked office. The papers. The signature. The life raft she had thrown him. The thank you he never gave. Margaret continued. But instead, every time the company grew stronger, you treated me like a reminder of the worst day of your life. Charles's mouth tightened. You don't know what it feels like. To be saved, she asked. To be pitied. Margaret took that in. There it was again. His pride. So hungry it had eaten their marriage. You were never pitied by me, she said. You were loved. The line landed softly. That made it hurt more. Charles looked down. Vanessa shifted beside him, suddenly out of place. The woman who had enjoyed Margaret's humiliation now stood in the wreckage of a marriage she had never truly understood. Margaret looked at both of them. Vanessa gave you something I stopped giving you, she said. Charles looked up. What? A version of yourself that never needed saving. Vanessa's lips parted, but no defense came. Because Margaret had named it. Vanessa had called him brilliant, visionary, unstoppable. She had built interviews around him, shaped speeches around him, polished his failures until they looked like strategy. And Charles had chosen the woman who fed his pride over the woman who protected his life's work. Margaret picked up her carry-on. Her hand was steady. You didn't want a partner, she said. You wanted applause. Outside, another plane lifted into the morning sky. Inside, Charles Bennett stood trapped in the truth. The company had depended on Margaret. His power had depended on Margaret. And the more he needed her, the harder he had worked to make her feel unnecessary. Margaret turned away. Not broken. Not begging. Just finally awake. Behind her, Charles whispered her name. But this time she did not stop. Vanessa Cole had entered Bennett Meridian Group like a polished answer to a question no one had asked. She was bright. Efficient. Always smiling at exactly the right moment. At first Margaret Whitmore had watched her from across conference tables and told herself not to imagine things. Vanessa knew how to speak to Charles Bennett. She praised his instincts. She laughed at his hard jokes. She used words like visionary, bold, and legacy, until Charles sat taller in his chair. Margaret had seen it. She had seen all of it. But back then she still believed patience was love. Now, in the airport terminal, the truth stood in front of her wearing a cream coat and holding a blue folder. Vanessa had not come to Dallas just to sit beside Charles on a plane. She had come to take Margaret's place. Not only beside the man. Inside the company. Margaret stopped near a row of empty leather seats and turned around. Vanessa was watching her. Charles stood a few feet away, still trying to rebuild control with phone calls and short angry messages. But Vanessa was quieter now. Her confidence had shifted into calculation. Margaret recognized it. That was the look of someone measuring the damage. Vanessa stepped closer. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her voice low, you're making this personal. Margaret looked at her. It became personal when you put your hand on my life and called it strategy. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. I was doing my job. No, Margaret said. You were doing Charles's ego. The words cut clean. Vanessa's face tightened, but she did not step back. You have no idea what it's been like inside that company, she said. Everyone tiptoes around the trust. Around your name. Around what you might approve. Margaret tilted her head. There it was. Not shame. Resentment. Vanessa had learned Charles's language well. You mean accountability, Margaret said. I mean control, Vanessa shot back. Charles looked over, alarmed now, but Vanessa kept going. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was scared. Maybe the folder in her arms had become too heavy to hold silently. He needed room to lead, Vanessa said. Not a wife standing in the background reminding everyone she saved him. Margaret absorbed the sentence without blinking. For years, Charles had whispered those same wounds in different forms. Now, they came out of Vanessa's mouth. Rehearsed. Polished. Weaponized. Margaret stepped closer. And your solution was to write a statement that would push the Whitmore trust out of influence. Vanessa's lips parted. Margaret continued. To make me look unstable if I objected. Vanessa said nothing. To use a public humiliation as proof that I was acting emotionally. Still nothing. Margaret's voice dropped. And then to walk into Dallas with Charles as if you were the new center of power. Vanessa looked down at the blue folder. Just once. But once was enough. Charles moved toward them quickly. Vanessa, don't say another word. Margaret turned to him. She already has. The supervisor glanced up from the counter. The gate agent looked away. Around them, strangers moved through the airport, but the small circle around Margaret, Charles, and Vanessa felt sealed off from the world. Vanessa finally spoke quieter now. You don't understand. Charles was drowning under your shadow. Margaret looked at Charles. His face changed. Not denial. Recognition. That hurt more than the affair. Because Vanessa had been given access to the deepest crack in their marriage. She had not stumbled into it. She had used it. She had fed his insecurity until it became a plan. A plan with credentials. A plan with a memo. A plan with a blue folder and a first-class seat. Margaret's voice softened, but her words did not. You were never trying to protect the company, Vanessa. You were trying to remove the woman who could say no. Vanessa's eyes flickered. Margaret nodded slowly. That is why you wanted the trust weakened. Not because it endangered the business. Because it endangered your access to Charles. Charles said her name. Margaret. She did not look away from Vanessa. You thought standing beside him meant you had power, Margaret said. But real power is not being chosen by a weak man. Real power is being able to stop him when he is wrong. Vanessa's face went pale. The blue folder slipped slightly in her hands. For the first time that morning she looked young, not innocent, just exposed. Margaret picked up her phone and sent one final message to Harold. Add Vanessa Cole to the compliance review. Full access history. Communications records. Dallas statement chain. Then she slid the phone back into her purse. Charles stared at her helpless now. Vanessa stared at the floor. Margaret turned toward the terminal exit. Behind her, the blue folder bent under Vanessa's grip. The thing meant to replace Margaret had only revealed how badly they needed her gone. And now everyone knew why. Margaret Whitmore was halfway toward the terminal exit when Harold called again. She stopped beside a tall window overlooking the runway. Planes moved beyond the glass, slow and powerful, carrying people toward places where their lives had not fallen apart before breakfast. Margaret answered. Tell me. Harold did not waste time. There's another name connected to the Dallas agenda. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Who? Stephen Bennett. The sound of that name pulled the air from the space around her. Charles's older brother. A board member. A man who smiled in public, stayed quiet in meetings, and always appeared when power was shifting hands. Margaret turned slowly. Across the terminal, Charles Bennett was standing near the premium counter, still with Vanessa Cole at his side. But now he was not looking at Margaret. He was looking at his phone. Waiting. Harold continued. Stephen's office submitted a restructuring note early this morning. It was attached to the same Dallas packet. Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of restructuring? A proposal to reduce the Whitmore Trust's oversight authority. There it was. The second blade. Not Charles. Not Vanessa. Stephen. Margaret stared through the glass as a plane lifted from the runway, its wheels folding into its body like a secret disappearing. For years, Stephen Bennett had treated her with a careful politeness that never reached his eyes. At holiday dinners, he called her the steady one. In board meetings, he praised her conservative thinking with a smile sharp enough to cut paper. He had never liked the trust. He had never liked that Margaret's signature carried more weight than his last name. And now, while Charles humiliated his wife at the gate, Stephen had been waiting in Dallas with a clean corporate solution. A restructuring. A vote. A quiet removal. Margaret's voice lowered. Was Stephen copied on the strategic communications memo? Harold paused. Yes. Margaret closed her eyes for 1 second. The affair had been the show. The memo had been the script. Stephen's proposal was the real target. They were going to use her pain as leverage. If she reacted, they would call her unstable. If she blocked the money, they would call her dangerous. If she stayed silent, they would walk into Dallas and tell the board the company needed protection from the woman who had protected it first. Margaret opened her eyes. Send me the restructuring note. It's already on your secure portal. Her phone vibrated. She opened the file. The words appeared in clean corporate language. Emergency governance adjustment. Temporary reduction of trust-backed approval rights. Executive independence during reputational disruption. Margaret almost laughed. Reputational disruption. That was what Stephen called betrayal. That was what Charles called consequences. That was what Vanessa was prepared to turn into a press statement. Margaret looked back at Charles. This time he saw her watching. His face changed. He knew. He knew Harold had found it. Vanessa leaned close to him and whispered something fast. Charles did not answer. Margaret walked back toward them. Slowly. No rush. No fear. Just the quiet sound of her heels against the airport floor. Charles straightened. Margaret, whatever Harold is telling you, Stephen is in this. The words stopped him cold. Vanessa's face went blank. Not surprised enough. Margaret noticed that too. She stepped closer. Your brother filed a restructuring note this morning. Attached to the Dallas packet. Same chain as Vanessa's memo. Same timing as your unauthorized travel approval. Charles swallowed. That's board procedure. No, Margaret said. That's a coup dressed in legal language. Vanessa looked away. Margaret turned to her. And you knew. Vanessa's silence answered before her mouth could. Charles reached for Margaret's arm. She moved before he touched her. Don't. The word was quiet. Final. A few passengers near the gate stopped walking. Charles lowered his hand. Margaret faced him fully. You didn't just bring your mistress on a trip. You brought her to help sell the story. Stephen brought the knife. You brought the spectacle. Charles's voice cracked. You're twisting this. Margaret shook her head. No, Charles. For the first time I'm reading it exactly as written. She lifted her phone. Harold, add Stephen Bennett to the compliance hold. Preserve every email, every draft, every board communication connected to Dallas. Harold's voice came through clearly. Understood. Charles stepped back like the floor had shifted under him. Vanessa clutched the blue folder again, but now it looked useless. Because the folder was only one piece. Margaret had found the whole machine. The affair. The memo. The restructuring note. The brother waiting in Dallas. All of it designed to push her out of the company she had saved. Margaret looked at Charles one last time. You wanted me embarrassed enough to disappear. Her voice did not shake. But I'm still here. Outside, another plane roared down the runway. Inside, Charles Bennett stood silent. And somewhere in Dallas, Stephen Bennett's carefully planned morning had just begun to collapse. Margaret Whitmore did not wait for Charles Bennett to explain. There was nothing left to explain. The pattern was too clean now. Vanessa's blue folder. The unauthorized communications credential. The Dallas statement. Stephen Bennett's restructuring note. All of it built around one goal. Push Margaret out before she could stop them. She stood near the premium counter, phone in hand, the bright airport lights reflecting off the glass behind her. Charles watched her like a man seeing a door close from the wrong side. Harold, Margaret said into the phone, activate the protective clause in the Whitmore Trust Agreement. Charles's face changed instantly. No. One word. Not angry now. Afraid. Vanessa looked at him. What clause? Margaret did not answer her. Harold's voice remained calm. Mrs. Whitmore, activating that clause will suspend discretionary executive privileges, freeze pending strategic approvals connected to trust-backed guarantees, and require compliance review before any governance changes. Do it, Margaret said. Charles stepped forward. Margaret, you don't understand how this will look. She turned to him. I understand exactly how it will look. Her voice was quiet. It will look documented. That word hit harder than a threat. Documented meant timelines. Names. Access logs. Drafts. Approvals. No more whispers. No more polished speeches. No more blaming the wife who refused to break on command. Harold continued. Operational protections remain active. Margaret's answer came fast. Yes. Payroll stays protected. Vendor payments stay protected. Employee travel stays protected. Technical, legal, finance, and logistics teams remain cleared. The supervisor, still nearby with his tablet, looked up. Margaret spoke clearly enough for him to hear. No employees are to be punished for executive misconduct. Charles's jaw tightened. Executive misconduct. That's what you're calling it now. Margaret looked straight at him. That is what the documents will call it if the review confirms what the documents already show. Vanessa's fingers went white around the folder. For the first time, she seemed to understand that charm had limits. A smile could open a door. A compliment could soften a man. A headline could shift attention. But it could not erase an audit trail. Margaret walked to the counter and set her phone down on speaker. Harold confirmed the scope. Yes, ma'am, he said. Personal luxury travel benefits for Charles Bennett and Vanessa Cole remain suspended. The standby aircraft is removed from discretionary executive use. The Dallas Strategic Communications packet is frozen. Stephen Bennett's restructuring proposal is held pending conflict review. All essential company functions remain active. The gate agent's expression shifted. Professional surprise. Then respect. Charles looked around. Too many people had heard. He had spent the morning trying to make Margaret look emotional. But every sentence she spoke sounded like governance. Like protection. Like leadership. Vanessa leaned toward Charles and whispered, "Can Stephen override this?" Margaret heard it. So did Harold. No, Harold said through the phone before Charles could answer. Not while the protective clause is active. Vanessa stepped back. The blue folder dropped slightly from her chest. Charles stared at the phone as if Harold himself had betrayed him. Margaret picked it up again. Notify the board, she said. Full statement. No accusations. Just the facts. Unauthorized credential, suspended discretionary privileges, preservation of records, protection of operations, compliance review. Harold answered, I'll send it now. Charles's voice broke through the moment. You're going to destroy everything because I made a mistake. Margaret froze. A mistake. The word floated between them. A mistress in first class. A secret authorization. A prepared memo. A brother's restructuring plan. A calculated attempt to remove her from power. A mistake? Margaret turned slowly. No, Charles, she said. A mistake is forgetting a meeting. A mistake is missing a call. She looked at Vanessa. Then back at him. This was a plan. Charles had no answer. Margaret's phone buzzed. A message from Harold. Protective clause activated. Board notice pending. Essential operations secured. Margaret read it once. Then she closed the screen. Outside, the Dallas flight began pushing back from the gate. The plane moved without Charles. Without Vanessa. Without the blue folder. But with the authorized employees still on board. The company continued. Just not under the cover of their lies. Charles watched the aircraft roll away from the glass. His face emptied. Vanessa lowered herself into a seat, the folder resting on her lap like dead weight. Margaret picked up her purse. For the first time that morning her breathing felt steady. She had not saved her marriage. Maybe that had been gone for years. But she had saved what mattered. The workers. The records. The truth. And as the plane disappeared toward the runway, Charles Bennett finally understood the one thing he had spent 4 years denying. Margaret Whitmore had never needed to raise her voice to take back control. The board notice went out before the Dallas flight reached the runway. A simple message. No drama. No accusations. Just facts. But facts, when arranged in the right order, can hit harder than any scream. At 9:06 a.m., every board member of Bennett Meridian Group received Harold's formal notice. Protective clause activated. Discretionary executive privileges suspended. Strategic approvals under review. Records preserved. Operations protected. Charles Bennett read the message on his phone in the middle of the airport terminal. His face went pale. Vanessa Cole saw it before he could hide it. What does it say? She whispered. Charles did not answer. Because he could already feel the walls closing in. A second message arrived. Then a third. Board members. Legal counsel. Compliance. His phone became a storm in his hand. Margaret Whitmore stood several feet away, watching him with the calm of someone who had finally stopped hoping he would become honest on his own. The supervisor at the premium counter received his own update. He looked down at the tablet, then up at Charles. Mr. Bennett, he said carefully, I've been instructed to inform you that your executive access has been suspended pending internal review. Charles stiffened. That was already done. This is broader, sir. The word broader made Vanessa stop breathing. The supervisor continued. Your authority to approve discretionary travel executive communications packages and trust-backed strategic changes has been temporarily frozen. Charles stared at him. For years people had called Charles decisive, visionary, untouchable. Now a man in a gray airport suit was reading the limits of his power from a tablet. Vanessa stepped forward. What about me? The supervisor looked at her. Miss Cole, your access credentials to Bennett Meridian's executive communications system have also been suspended pending review. The blue folder slipped in her hands. She caught it against her stomach. But the gesture looked weak now. Almost childish. Margaret's phone rang. Harold again. She answered, turning slightly away. Go ahead. The board has acknowledged receipt, Harold said. 2 independent directors have requested an emergency session. Compliance has frozen Vanessa Cole's access history. Stephen Bennett has been notified of conflict review. Margaret looked across the terminal. Charles was staring directly at her now. Not with anger. With disbelief. As if he still could not accept that the woman he had humiliated had moved faster, cleaner, and smarter than all of them. What about Charles? Margaret asked. Harold's voice remained even. The board chair has placed him on temporary executive suspension until the review is complete. Margaret closed her eyes for half a second. Not in victory. In grief. Because no matter how necessary it was, this was still the end of something she once tried to save. Charles's phone rang at the same moment. He answered sharply. Yes. His expression collapsed as he listened. No, you can't suspend me without a vote. A pause. I am the president of this company. Another pause. His voice dropped. Stephen said what? Margaret opened her eyes. There it was. Even Stephen was stepping back now. Men like Stephen never stood too close to a fire once the smoke became public. Charles turned away, gripping the phone harder. Vanessa watched him with dawning fear. For the first time, she understood the cruelest part of borrowed power. When the man who gave it to you falls, you fall with him. Her own phone buzzed. She looked down. Then her face drained of color. Access denied. She tried again. Another denial. Her company email. Locked. Her executive drive. Locked. Her communications portal. Locked. The blue folder was all she had left. Paper in her hands. No system behind it. No authority beneath it. No Charles strong enough to protect her. Margaret walked toward them. Slowly. Charles ended his call and faced her. You got what you wanted, he said. Margaret shook her head. No. Her voice was soft. I wanted you to remember what mattered before you made me do this. Charles's eyes flickered. She looked at Vanessa. Your access is suspended because you used the company's voice to serve a private relationship. Vanessa swallowed. New argument came. Then Margaret looked back at Charles. And you are suspended because you let your pride become a risk to everyone who works for you. The words landed in the open terminal. Clear. Final. Charles looked toward the runway where the Dallas plane was now lifting into the cloudy sky. The company's people were on it. The work continued. But he was not leading it. Not today. Maybe not ever again. Vanessa slowly lowered the blue folder onto the counter. Not handed over. Not surrendered with dignity. Just set down because she no longer had the strength to hold the lie. Margaret picked up her purse. The airport lights reflected in her eyes. No smile. No triumph. Only the quiet pain of a woman who had protected the truth longer than anyone deserved. Behind her, Charles Bennett stood suspended from his own kingdom. Vanessa Cole stood locked out of the power she thought she had earned. And somewhere beyond the terminal, Stephen Bennett's name had just entered an investigation he never believed would reach him. Margaret Whitmore did not look back until she reached the glass doors of the terminal. Behind her, Charles Bennett stood beside the premium counter, stripped of his title, his privileges, and the illusion that power belonged to him alone. Vanessa Cole sat with the blue folder on her lap, staring at nothing. The woman who had smiled in first class now had no access, no protection, and no place beside the company's future. 3 months later, Margaret signed the divorce papers in a quiet office downtown. No cameras. No headlines. No dramatic speech. Just her name at the bottom of the page. This time her signature did not save Charles. It saved herself. Bennett Meridian Group continued without him. Employees kept their jobs. Contracts stayed alive. The board rebuilt under clean oversight. Stephen Bennett faced investigation and Vanessa disappeared from the company directory like a name erased from glass. Margaret moved into a small house near the water. Every morning she walked alone with coffee in her hand, watching the sun rise over the harbor. No first-class lounge. No private jet. No man beside her, pretending she was less than she was. And still she felt lighter than she had in 22 years. Because dignity does not need luxury. Peace does not need applause. And sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is stop protecting the person who keeps breaking her. Never mistake silence for weakness. Some people stay quiet because they are patient, loyal, and loving. But when that loyalty is abused, their silence can become the beginning of justice. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments, would you have walked away or would you have fought back like Margaret? And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories about courage, betrayal, and the moment ordinary people finally take their power back.